Hi everyone, this is Eileen Burns and welcome to Disempowered to Empowered. Now today I'm going to talk about what makes us all feel disempowered and even society disempowered, and what actually turns that around. What can make someone feel more empowered no matter what the circumstances they are dealing with. So what causes or triggers disempowerment? What continues disempowerment, and what moves someone or a society from disempowerment to empowerment? So we're going to look a little bit at some sort of descriptions of disempowerment and empowerment, and we're going to look at it from different angles, okay? So in the Learner's Dictionary, when they talk about disempower, they describe disempower as to cause a person or a group of people to be less likely than others to succeed, to prevent a person or group from having power, authority, or influence. They have been disempowered by a society that believes they are intellectually inferior or disempowered minorities. Now, that is actually just one description. In that dictionary, they're talking about just a certain type of disempowerment, right? So disempowerment, the disempowerment of minorities, but disempowerment actually shows up in all sorts of ways, okay? And we can all feel disempowered, not just to do with being intellectually inferior, okay? We can feel disempowered if there is other things that we feel are at a different level. So it's to do with power and authority, or even control or influence, where we think something is maybe unattainable because of lack of resources or skills. But we're going to look at that a little bit moment after we go into looking at what examples of disempowerment are, right? So if you think about, like, we see in society for there was many centuries where people, certain sort of groups or minority groups of people, faced tremendous disempowerment, and we see that when people were treated in slavery, and we see a lot of the challenges that many ethnic minorities face, okay, disabled minorities, okay, and we also see very much sometimes in workplaces, and this still happens, but that level of disempowerment may have been even a lot worse in many years ago, where we see management versus employees, where there's such a control and maybe lack of respect and value that people are disempowered than empowered, okay? Also, this can happen teachers versus students, where the authority manipulates their power, okay? And this is where examples where people manipulate the power and actually disempower the student or even a child, by some of the things that they do, okay? Because they have a certain amount of authority or even control or leadership in a certain situation, and they can choose to empower the student or disempower the student. We also can see this in parenting. Okay, now parenting is not obviously an easy one. It comes with its challenges, but there has to be a certain amount of authority, but there also has to be a certain amount where you empower your child. If you're very authoritarian and controlling, it disables the child. If you do not give the child their own power and give their strength and empower them and do things to empower them. You can also see it in examples of doctor versus patient. And that's something I'm going to talk about a little bit more. But we see also in person versus society. So sometimes the society we live in, the culture, even if it's a religious society or a society with certain types of views, can actually in many ways disempower the person belonging to that society, particularly if they are feel and conditioned to adhere to a society's rules and guidelines that may not actually be very balanced. Okay, that this is where that can create disempowerment. We can also see this in person versus the government system. So it's the same kind of thing where the government has certain things. And one example also is even things like benefit system. And that's a system where certain types of people are entitled, but certain people are not, and you have to fit into a category. And sometimes people are not in categories, but they have to be reliant, and it's someone in authority that's making that decision. And they can do things to empower people, or they can make choices to disempower. Okay, and that's the reality, and it comes in so many levels, because the person who is sick or ill, who's unable to work for whatever reason, is relying on someone else to make certain monetary or other decisions on them that really seriously impacts their life. So basically, it's like someone else has the control over certain things, and that can be very disempowering. And that's something that I'm going to touch on as well, right? So let's look a little bit about empowerment. Okay, so this is actually a better description for the way it explains empowerment, and if we shift the opposite, that explains more really what disempowerment is. But if you look at empowerment by the Oxford Dictionary, is authority or power given to someone to do something. Individuals are given empowerment to create their own dwellings. The process of becoming stronger and more confident, especially in controlling one's life and claiming one's rights. Now, a good example is political steps for the empowerment of women. So that was an empowering situation. That was an empowering agenda. Okay, so before women were unable to have political rights, they were disempowered, right? So if you look at that, empowerment is about giving someone their power back to do something, to make certain decisions, to have certain choices. It gives you an idea. When you take those choices away, when someone takes the power away, where someone is controlling someone else's life in any sort of capacity, right? That is a situation for disempowerment, okay? So examples of situations or things or resources that actually empower someone is education. So when you give someone education, any sort of education, that starts empowering them, okay? The more that we become educated in certain areas, okay, and the more we learn certain skills, we become more empowered. And one of the things that I know is when I look at anxiety and stress, I learned very early on that most people have never been taught skills how to manage the stress, how to manage their anxiety. It's been very far down on the sort of list of priorities, where it really should be really high up in priorities. And that is one of the reasons why I believe that things like meditation should be taught in schools, and I believe that more organisations and society as a whole should be equipping people to feel more empowered. Because if we look at society, people don't realise it, but they are relying on things like doctors. They're relying on certain things for things that often they can help themselves. They just don't know how to help themselves, or they just don't have the awareness, or they're so busy, or there's certain patterns of behaviour and thought, and their thoughts and the belief has actually thwarted or distorted their perception that they can actually empower themselves. And this is actually, it's about taking self-responsibility. So knowledge, truth is also an example of empowerment. Now we can look through society and look through many decades where and many times through history where truth has not been given, right? People didn't get the truth from the governments, they didn't get truth from even the medical profession, they didn't see the whole truth, they weren't being given the truth, right? And I am a bit of a truth seeker that way, right? And I'll explain why. And when you exploit people from the truth or rob them of the truth or the reality, right? Even if it's hard to take, you actually are disempowering people, right? Because you're not giving them the full picture, right? So it's a hard one because there's sometimes some information is so bad that a human, for the human race to understand and to comprehend and to cope with it, right? And I understand that. But there's also a certain element where I just think that the people are not always getting the truth about a lot of things and not seeing it. And because they're so busy, they don't have the time. And often it's not till circumstances happen to them or situations that make them look at things a bit different. They start seeking the truth about certain things, okay? And that is something else I'm going to talk a little bit about. But if you look at freedom, the more freedom that you have, the more you can feel empowered. So again, when people feel as if they're robbed from their freedom of rights, okay, their freedom of speech. And one of the things that I'm seeing at the moment, big, because of the work that I do in this line of work, and the fact it also helps spiritual businesses, is that many people are, for example, a lot of people, that are maybe not in the type of work that I do, don't have any awareness in this, but there's a huge thing about censorship, and lots of people that are in the health, holistic and spiritual industry are getting banned from, for example, Twitter, Facebook. We are the encouragement of promoting health and helping people to be more empowered and make healthy decisions is actually getting robbed. And it's becoming that it's almost like this communism we're trying to get, it's coming in. And there's lots of reasons why that's happening. But what's happening is people's freedom of speech, freedom of choice is starting to be taken away. And one of the things is the biggest problem is happening in a way that many people are not noticing it. Some people are noticing it, other people are not aware, okay? So freedom makes us feel empowered. The more we get our certain freedoms taken away, that makes us feel disempowered. Choice, the choice to do certain things, the choice to be able to make choices in your life and decisions in your life is all about empowerment. When you get the choices taken away, again, it's a form of disempowerment. Equality, being treated equally, is empowerment. Being when there is not equality, that is disempowerment. Now, examples of empowerment is also really important is self-responsibility. But one of the things that I know is, and I see this with, seen this in clients for many years, and I've seen it in a lot of the work that I learned, that actually a lot of people don't take self-responsibility and don't recognize that they have, that they actually have, they're responsible for certain things. Again, because of lack of education, maybe knowledge, truth, all these things. There's lots of factors that can make people, and also unhealthy systems and the way that sometimes even society manipulates people. Because they feel disempowered, they actually stop taking responsibility, for example, for their own health, their own well-being, for certain things, because of already triggers or feelings of disempowerment. And this is why the more things that you have on the list that I'm talking about, it creates a cycle. So it's like the more types of things, so one form of disempowerment can actually lead to another form of disempowerment, okay? And then it becomes a cycle. And this is why it's very hard sometimes for people to go off that cycle. Also, if you've had experience as a child of we all have experiences as a child of being disempowered in certain times in a childhood, but if you're triggered by certain wounding, certain trauma, certain, things that happen to you, again, that can keep the disempowerment cycle going if you can't learn to cut it off, or you don't have the tools or the awareness to cut it off. So also examples of empowerment are independence, okay, and having the right resources. So, you know, and resources can come from the most thing that you actually have a roof over your head and you have food and you've got warmth, to resources actually being able to buy resources, getting access to resources, even as what we talked about education. So resources come in all sorts of ways, and the more that we can be resourceful and get access to resources, again, we are empowered. If someone is unable to get access to things, or access to resources, to education knowledge, again, they are more likely to be disempowered or to feel disempowered. Okay, so one of the reasons that I got into this work, and I would say it's one of the really big reasons that I get into the work, it's probably the drive that's always at the core of actually all my work, is about empowering people. And that was because my own circumstances made me feel disempowered. Okay, I was someone that, as most of my followers know, that I had a lot of rare medical challenges and chronic health challenges, right? And some of those challenges were quite extreme. Like, for example, one where I had threatened eye loss, right? Now, that was a condition that in many ways was, it didn't disable me as much, and I have to be very clear about this. It didn't obviously impact my life as much as my other conditions, but it was obviously what young woman wants to lose an eye, right? So the biggest problem I had was my eye pressure was so low that it basically it could come out, or it was getting into kind of damage, because what happens sometimes when the eye pressure drops, the eye starts filling up with water. Well, my eye was overfilling with water because it was classed as hypotonic. Now, my eye condition was really, really rare. They had never seen it in someone like me, and there's a lot of reasons why I think I got that. But the problem I had at that point wasn't just that it was something that I felt in a way powerless to control in a way, but the doctors were not giving me very positive, empowering possibilities. That was probably not. So there were some elements where I felt disempowered initially, the kind of shock of it, and traumatized by it, because it wasn't just that I had something, that it was almost like, well, we don't know what to do, and we don't think we can help you, right? So when someone feels as if there's no way out, right, and they've got no resources, that leads them to feeling completely disempowered. And this is the thing, is if they are so caught up, if that is something that's very important to them. So as a young woman, like most young women, I did not want to for not just to do with my sight, but to, the thought, the horror. I'm a very squeamish person. I'm strong in many ways, but I'm very squeamish. Now, the thought of it, actually, in many ways, I think I did push it down under the surface. I did kind of trying to not deal with it. And actually, I noticed a lot of my family members just kind of shut it out as if it wasn't real, right? It was like nobody kind of wanted to talk about it, and no one wanted to deal with it. And it was just, and thankfully, in one way, I come from a family where there is a lot of positive thinking and whatever. So that was, but there was another element where it was not talked about. Thankfully for me, I had already went down the holistic route, and I knew, having a holistic perspective, that there was always things that we could try and do, right? So that kicked in. I mean, someone that was quite determined and had a lot of tenacity and a will to try and overcome as much as I could, that kicked in. And that was my empowerment muscles and my other things in my life, that no matter how extreme my circumstances was, there was an element I could say, right, okay, I'm going to have to look what else I can do. Is there other things to do? How I eat? Is there other things I can do? Can I get different forms of healing? So that empowered me. But what that and many situations in my life led me to see was that in the medical system, and I have to say, and sometimes in the holistic system as well, was a lot of disempowerment, and I'll explain why. Not meant, but there was a lot of situations where a person could feel so much more disempowered. And I have to say, even though I am someone that, I invested most of my income in my health and my well-being and learned all sorts of things I could do, right? There's been many times in my life where I felt disempowered by the medical system, and I'll explain why, and the government, right? Why these type of circumstances are major triggers for people and can actually throw people into total apathy, total despair, depression, and all sorts of challenges, all because it triggers so much fear, right? So anything that causes people fear tends to, in many cases, pull people into disempowerment, right? Unless it's someone who can quickly turn that fear into a positive and find one way to go against it in a way, right? And what I mean is, I'm saying that and go against it, and really that's not the only reason. It's also having the ability to either be the witness to it and just be objective. So I have to bring that third one in, and I do talk about that third one. That's a lot of my teachings. But for the purpose of this, and to basically get into the head of most lay people who are not, are not in the sort of work that I do, they will either kind of fight against their fear, okay, or they will actually sink into despair or denial, right? Now, we have, no matter if we like it or not, we have created, for example, a medical system that tends to mostly treat symptoms. It does not treat cause. So in many ways, I always question, should it be called healthcare? Because there is more fixing of symptoms or trying to treat symptoms than trying to treat or prevent the disease, the actual original reason for the disease, right? And there's all sorts of examples in that. And one of the reasons that we have created in the UK a bit of a nanny state in relation to healthcare and people not taking responsibility for what they eat, what they do to their body, is, I believe, is partly because we have a free healthcare system, and also for, in many ways, sometimes an element of, I'm not saying this inequality, where sometimes people feel that their doctor or their professional is talking down to them. We have a situation where there's a lot of apathy, and we have a lot of situation where people are not always given the facts, right? So because they're not given the facts, they do not feel equipped to make the right choices. And we also have the element where some people feel that the person does always know better than them. So they give the power over to the doctor, to the nurse, to the practitioner, to even a therapist. Thankfully for me, I learned very early on in this. I kept experiencing it continually, and it opened my eyes in such a big way that I realised that even in the medical care system, no matter what expert you were speaking to, they only had a limited knowledge. They didn't know your body, they didn't know. So I quickly learned never ever to give and I'm not saying never ever, that's maybe not the right term, but to not just give my power away over to a practitioner. One of the things that was very alarming for me was that I had to, because of one of the really rare conditions I had, a friend of mine, I remember when I was quite ill and I was mostly housebound, she went to the Mitchell Library in Glasgow and went and done medical research for me about my condition, because I wanted to do it, I couldn't get access. So she went and got all the information for me, right? And I remember going to, and we're talking about really, we're not just talking about experts, we're talking about some of the there was one or two or three, in fact, people that I've seen, experts in the UK. One expert was an expert that was on the telly for certain things. I'm not going into too much because I don't want to give away who it was. But I remember recognising that these were people that were supposed to be top in the field. And one of the things that also happened to me was I was used as a medical case study. And I used to be once a year have to go into Glasgow, and all these students would line up and specialists and experts would come to look at me and to look at my eye. And one of the things out of that and all of the experiences I had with lots of different types of specialists, right, was that I realised that a lot of the way that they approached the practice, they were trying to, they didn't mean to, but they were actually disempowering. They were not helping the patient make decisions for themselves. And they had a very, very closed view. And I would go in and I'd have all this information and know back to front about so many things. Now, I wouldn't remember a lot of these things now, because it's a lot of heavy information that you need to be very accurate. But I used to go in and they would be gobsmacked at the questions I would ask them. And, most of them would say, you know more than me. And what it made me realise, and they'd say, I don't know that, And it made me realise that most people actually believe that these people know more than them all the time, and they always have their interests at heart. Now, like this is an example where they may believe that they have your health at heart. I realised very quickly that a lot of the things that if I had went by what I was advised would have been highly dangerous for me. And it made me realise that I had to, when it came to the medical profession, be empowered, be educated, get that knowledge, and to seek truth, right? To find the truth out about certain things, not kind of half, because one of the things that I also found was I got all sorts of diagnoses, I got all sorts of things said to me that I knew was not true, and it turned out not to be true. And these were serious mistakes, right? And then I was someone who was constantly, when I was sick, had a horrendous time with the benefit system, because I had rare medical challenges that didn't fit boxes. And I was treated appallingly. It was horrendous, some of the experiences I went through, right? And these were examples of situations where I was relying, I had no control. I was so ill, I couldn't do things. And I felt so disempowered, and I never wanted anyone to feel as disempowered as I did. So what my journey was all about was taking my power back, and no matter what I had to deal with, and to help other people be empowered. And one of the most important elements of that was helping people to manage their own stress, manage their own anxiety, and get to a stage where they do not rely on a doctor. They don't rely on a therapist or a counsellor or someone else to manage their own stress. And that's why I believe stress management is so important. Now, stress management is a very loose term used today, but I believe stress management is teaching the client, teaching the student, teaching the employee, teaching the service user, okay, how to live a more healthy life, how to be able to cope with stress, how to be able to cope with anxiety and stress, how to manage their anxiety and stress, be more resilient. That is empowerment, because you're giving them the tools. And I studied many different therapies, and I went to different therapists, and, you know, and in many ways there was a lot of it. It was an amazing journey, right? Because despite having horrendous experience with my health, and even really some awful experiences in the holistic sector, I learned so much. But I also recognised, even when I studied to be a therapist, that also a lot of they said it had a holistic approach, but you were still treating symptoms. You were